بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبد الله ورسوله صلوات الله وسلامه عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. So tonight inshallah we'll touch on the second last topic that has to do with Ramadan, and that is Zakatul Fitr. Now Zakatul Fitr is mentioned by some fuqaha in the chapter of fasting. The reason for that is because it comes at the end of Ramadan, or it's connected to Ramadan, or because it's connected to Ramadan, so they mention it there. And other fuqaha mention it in the chapter of Zakaah because it's a charity that is given that is somewhat obligatory, and it's connected to wealth. So therefore, it's mentioned in the chapter of Zakaah. And then other ulama, some call it Zakatul Fitr, and others call it Sadaqatul Fitr. Others call it Sadaqatul Fitr. So, because it's also a type of charity. Now the word sadaqah, they speak on why is it sadaqah called sadaqah? Why is charity called sadaqah? So they say it comes from the root letters sad, dal, qaf. So sad, dal, qaf, sadaqah, it has a few meanings in Arabic. One of the meanings of sadaqah, it gives off a meaning of to give genuineness. So it shows that a person is genuine to Allah. When he gives his money out to somebody, in reality, money he's earned and worked for, then he's giving it to somebody else. Yes, there's the human compassion side to help somebody else, but in reality, he's giving that money away. And in theory, he'd be getting nothing in return. So he's giving it solely seeking the reward of Allah, and Allah Himself has promised that whoever gives charity, Allah will give them multiple more in return, and that's a promise of Allah that a person trusts and builds on. So he shows his genuineness to Allah by giving sadaqah. So that's why this charity, sadaqah, is called sadaqah. And connected to this is the dowry that you give a woman. It's called mahr, but it's also called sadaaq. It's also called sadaaq from, again, sad, dal, qaf, sadaqah. So again, why is it called sadaaq? It's because it proves a man's genuineness towards the woman. That's why he's giving her this amount of wealth. It's called sadaaq as well. And then some of the scholars mentioned in some Shafi'i books, Waqi' ibn al-Jarrah, he says that Sadaqatul Fitr or Zakatul Fitr is like sajdah to sahu in salah. So for something that you've done, a mistake you've made in salah, then sajdah to sahu will kind of make up for this mistake. So the same way, Sadaqatul Fitr will make up for whatever lapses you've had in your fasts. That's why Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said about it, طُهْرَةً لِلصَّائِمِ مِنَ اللَّغْوِ وَالرَّفَثِ وَطُعْمَةً لِلْمَسَاكِينِ. That Sadaqatul Fitr is there to cleanse the fasting person for anything that he said or did that was not appropriate for someone fasting. So this will cleanse it off. So that's why he gives Sadaqatul Fitr. Now the ulama say, now we'll discuss this inshallah next week when we do Salatul Eid. They say in your Eid khutbah of Ramadan Eid, you mention the rules of Sadaqatul Fitr. So that applies, and we'll mention it next week. But the reality is, by the time you reach the khutbah of Eid, the wajib and the sunnah time of Sadaqatul Fitr would be over. So now you'd come into the makruh and, according to some, the haram time or the qadha time. The qadha time, according to those who call it qadha. But the sunnah and the wajib time for Sadaqatul Fitr would have passed already. Hence, it's mentioned in Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq from Abdullah ibn Tha'laba that 2 or 3 days or a couple of days before the day of Eid, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam used to give a kind of a khutbah, used to give a speech to the Sahaba explaining to them the rules of Sadaqatul Fitr, how much should be given out and to who should it be given out to. So they recommend that such a lecture is given maybe the Friday before the Eid or a few days before the Eid. The ulama give a lecture to people to inform them of the rules connected to Zakatul Fitr so that people can give it out in the correct manner. And then Zakatul Fitr is also Zakatul Fitr. So it's termed Fitr. And fitr, it's for iftar. The daily iftar is called iftar, the daily breaking of the fast, from the word fitr, and more so is a fitr from Ramadan itself. Fitr from Ramadan itself, from the fasting of Ramadan itself, which is the day of Eid. So this shows that this type of charity is only given by somebody who reached a portion of Ramadan. That means even somebody who did not fast, in the days of Ramadan, either for a reason or even for no reason, he gives Sadaqatul Fitr. And Sadaqatul Fitr will also be given on behalf of or from the wealth of the child, and to the extent, as we'll discuss just now, even for a fetus. So then they say, وَهَذِهِ يُرَادُ بِهَا الصَّدَقَةِ عَنِ الْبَدَنِ. So they say Sadaqatul Fitr is a charity on behalf of a person's body, not on behalf of a person's wealth. Zakah is for your wealth, but charity, Zakatul Fitr, has to do with your body. And a few masail connected to this, we're going to discuss them later, but just to point out the meaning of this actually, would be something like a debt that you owe. Now in zakah, you deduct the debt that you owe from your worth, and then you'd see how much is remaining to know whether you give zakah or not, because it's connected to your wealth. This zakah of Ramadan, of fitr, you do not deduct your debt, because it's connected to your body, and your body is what you use to fast. We're going to discuss it just now. And if you're going to give Zakatul Fitr, on behalf of yourself or for somebody else, you're going to give Zakatul Fitr in which place? In the place where your body is at the time when it's wajib on you, because it's connected to your body. We're going to discuss that also just now. So then they say, وَتَجِبُ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْبَوَادِ وَغَيْرِهِمْ وَتَجِبُ فِي مَالِ يَتِيمٍ. So they say that Zakatul Fitr is wajib. They say it's wajib on every Muslim, even on the wealth of an orphan. So a person is looking after an orphan. This orphan has wealth. He has enough wealth that he is not poor himself. That means this person looking after him, if this orphan is poor, this person looking after him has to spend on him from this person's own wealth. But if the yatim, this orphan, has enough wealth in him with himself, then the wali, the person looking after this orphan, will take from can take from the wealth of the orphan to give Zakatul Fitr on behalf of the orphan. And this also applies to a person's child. Let's say the child has wealth, maybe through gifts or whatever. So he is now not deemed poor. So the person can look after the child from the child's own wealth if he wants to, because it's not wajib on him to support this child. Then he can, the parents or the guardian, the father or the person, the wali, the wasi, they can take from the wealth of the child to give Zakatul Fitr on behalf of the child. And then they say that how do we deduce who should give Zakatul Fitr in terms of how much wealth should you have on the day of Eid, when it's wajib time for Zakatul Fitr? How much wealth should you have for us to say you have to give Zakatul Fitr? They say you must have an amount over and above your needs, the amount of a sar. Now sar, we discussed earlier in our first or second lesson how much is a sar. So what they say, this means that a person is going to calculate what he's worth. He's going to calculate his necessities. That means what he needs. They say his vehicle to move, his car that he needs to go up and down, the car that he needs, not the extra one. His clothes that he needs. And they say if he needs any employees to specifically help his house or his business, then this is a third thing. And they say fourthly, his house that he needs to stay in. And they also add any assets that a person has that he needs to sell to make a living for himself, which would be like trading stock. He includes that in working out his worth. And some of the fuqaha say if a person is a student of knowledge, then he also includes his books amongst his necessities that he calculates to count his worth, and a lady, her jewelry as well. Others do not include either of the two, and others only exclude the jewelry. So a person would calculate all of these things, right? He calculates all of these things, and he'll calculate his entire worth. So he's going to calculate his entire worth, then deduct all of these necessities, these 5, 6, 7 things. 7 things he'd deduct. If what he has, monetary or out of the worth of the assets that's remaining, is more than the price of a sa' that he has to give in Zakatul Fitr that we're going to mention, then Zakatul Fitr is wajib on him. So why do we say an asset? Because in theory a person can sell the asset that he doesn't need. He can sell, let's say he has a TV in his house. He doesn't need this TV. He can sell it in theory, get the money and then buy his Zakatul Fitr. So they include the asset and they include the wealth that he needs, the money that he has. And they say for a person to have that amount remaining, to give Sadaqatul Fitr on himself and those who he financially supports. So all of them together, he must have remaining after all of his worth, deduct his assets, the remaining amount must be more than what he needs for Zakatul Fitr for himself and everyone he financially supports, that we're going to discuss just now in more detail. So if after deducting and doing this calculation he has enough, then he has to give Sadaqatul Fitr. Okay, let's say he has less than the full amount of a full sa' for each person, then he has to give the amount even if it's less than a sa'. So he has to give even if it's less than a sa'. So here, the majority of the ulama, excluding the Hanafi madhab, they say you do not need to have nisaab. You do not need to have the nisaab. Less than the nisaab, they say you must have the amount of a sa'. And we're going to see a sa' of wheat or barley or cottage cheese and things like that. That's what you're going to need. That's what you're going to need. And the Hanafi madhab say you must have to own the nisaab. To own the nisaab for Zakatul Fitr to be obligatory on you. And then they say, if you have less than a sa', so you give on yourself less than a sa', done. But let's say you have for yourself a full sa', and then for somebody else that you are financially responsible, you cannot afford a full sa' for that person. In that case, you give the amount that you have that's less than a sa'. And let's say you give half a sa' you can afford. Then that person, whether it be your wife, whether you have to support your parents, so they are included, then they out of their own pocket, they can complete the sa'. They can complete the sa'. Okay. And then if there are two people it's wajib on them to support somebody else. So this is what you learn in the chapter of nafaqah, of expenditure. So that would mean, they say many times that a person has to spend on somebody else the amount that they inherit from somebody else. So if you are going to inherit, let's say 50%, your share, if your family member were to pass away now, you'd inherit, let's say, a quarter of his wealth. And let's say your brother would also inherit a quarter. So that means for Zakatul Fitr, you have to give a quarter, your brother has to give a quarter. So that's how it would work for somebody else when more than one person are responsible for the financial, to support somebody else financially. If you have to support somebody else financially, more than one person, they give that amount of the sa', of the amount of Zakatul Fitr, as amount that they would inherit. Because when they have to inherit, let's say only a quarter from the person, because then somebody else would be getting another quarter and somebody else a half. So these three would have to support that person financially, this person taking care of his expenses for a quarter of the expenses, the other person a quarter, the other person the remaining half. So same thing as Zakatul Fitr. Person A would give a quarter of the sa', and the second one a quarter of the sa', and the last person would give the remaining half sa'. That's how it would work. And they say debt does not stop. So it does not stop Zakatul Fitr. So you don't deduct the debt. You don't deduct the debt. When you're calculating your assets and your worth, you're not going to deduct the debts that you owe unless the debt is due. If it is due now, when it's time for Zakatul Fitr, then you deduct it. Otherwise, you do not deduct the debt. And then they say that a person has to give Zakatul Fitr on who? On himself, number one. And then they say anyone else that he is responsible for financially. So like his wives, like certain relatives that they mention in the chapter of nafaqah. We're going to make an indication to these things as we go along, inshallah. And they say if a person volunteers to look after somebody else financially for the entire month of Ramadan, so let's say your parents, let's say your mother came to visit you, and now for the month of Ramadan you are going to take care of her financially for this entire month, from beginning of Ramadan to the end of Ramadan, then in that case you have to give Sadaqatul Fitr on behalf of her. So that means that you have to look after the person financially the entire month of Ramadan, and also if a few people are looking after that person, then they don't have to give Zakatul Fitr. Only if one person is responsible. If one person is responsible, so this is voluntary. This is not a waajib, a responsible waajib financial support. This is voluntary for the month of Ramadan. Then you also give Zakatul Fitr, because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Addu sadaqatul fitri amman tamunahu." And then they say, if a person cannot afford for everyone that he supports financially, then he gives first. He has to then give Sadaqatul Fitr for himself first. And then if he has anything left, he gives on behalf of his wives. He gives on behalf of his wives. So if a person has more than one wife, and he can't afford for all of them, then what do we do? Anyone have an answer? That we say that if a person cannot afford Sadaqatul Fitr for everyone that he supports financially, he can only afford for a few. So number one, for himself. Then he starts with himself. The second person that he looks at from those who he can afford are his wives. So this person has more than one wife, but he can't afford for all the wives. Which wife does he choose?
The first one he was married.
The first one, but what if he doesn't like her the most? They say here he does.
Or the second option would be the one wife which he likes the most.
I don't know. So they say in this case a person would like draw a lottery. So he'll do a qur'ah, they call it. In many cases you do qur'ah. So you basically draw a lot, put the names in a bag and pull out the name, and whichever one comes out, then that's the fairest way you can decide who to give Sadaqatul Fitr on behalf of, if you have more than one wife and you cannot afford. And then they say he gives on behalf of his mother, then his father, then his children. And that is because your parents come before your children. Your parents come before your children. So then after your children, then you'd support those closest to you in terms of who would inherit from you, in terms of those who would inherit from you. So in general, that'd be your brothers, your sisters, then your uncles, your aunts, it would go like that. Your cousins, it would go like that. And then they say it's mustahab, not wajib, it's mustahab to give Sadaqatul Fitr on behalf of a fetus, Even if the fetus is less than 40 days, it's still mustahab to give on behalf of the fetus. And then they say, if somebody has to give Zakatul Fitr on somebody else, so the head of the household, let's say the husband. So the husband is going to support his wife, he's going to support his children. Then who does he support? They say if the parents or the children are poor, the parents or the children are poor, then you support them. And they poor and they're not physically able to go out and get work, then you support them. And then for your other relatives, this is a mas'ala they mention in nafaqah. So I'm just summarizing it very quickly off my head. And those relatives that are poor and that aren't capable of finding work and working, and you'd inherit from them if they were to die right now. Those are the people who it will be wajib on you to support. Now this mas'ala, the way I mention it now, is very similar to the Hanafi madhab. The Shafi'i and Maliki, they mainly include the parents upwards, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and children and grandchildren downwards. But they do not mention it to the extent of the Hanafi and hanbali for uncles and brothers and those like that, or those you'd inherit from. But now we're sticking on the hanbali madhab, which is very similar to Hanafi. So it would be those that are poor from your parents upwards, grandparents, great-grandparents, and your children, and also your relatives who are poor and unable to work, and you'd inherit from them if they were to die. You'd inherit from them right now if they were to die. Those are the people it's obligatory on you to support financially. Unless there's a father. If there's a father there, the father has to, if more than one person will inherit, just like I explained just now, then the 2 or 3 people who will inherit from that relative, they have to support that relative financially. Unless one of those relatives who would inherit is a father, then the father would take care of all the financial responsibility of that person, not the others. So therefore, these are the people that you're going to have to give Zakatul Fitr on behalf, right? When it comes to relatives, then obviously your wife, obviously.
This is the only case if you're paying against that you're paying the zakat for the someone who does not live with you, right?
Yeah, I'm coming to that one. Yeah. So these are the people that you're going to have to give Zakatul Fitr on behalf of. That's wajib on you to look after them. So you give Zakatul Fitr on their behalf. And also someone who's wajib for you to look after is your wife. And the last one who is wajib on you with regard. So these people you have to give Zakatul Fitr on top of the financial responsibility that's on you. And then also in Zakatul Fitr, that person who lives with you or you are taking care of financially in the whole month of Ramadan. So these 3 categories of people, those relatives, the wife, and this person who's staying with you for the month of Ramadan that you are looking after financially for the month of Ramadan, these people you have to give Zakatul Fitr on their behalf in the hanbali madhab. In fact, in most of the madhab. But I'm going to mention Hanafi just now. So now, these people you can give their Zakatul Fitr without their permission. You can give Zakatul Fitr without their permission. You do not need them to give you permission, actually give you permission. And if they gave out Zakatul Fitr themselves, even without your permission, it's permissible. Because the Zakatul Fitr is actually obligatory on them. So not on you, you are secondary. So if they've given out their own Zakatul Fitr on behalf of themselves, then it counts, it counts. And then, if let's say as the husband, he refuses to give Zakatul Fitr on behalf of his wife, does it then fall that the wife has to give Zakatul Fitr on behalf of herself? The answer is no. She can out of mustahab, but it's not wajib on her to do so. If the husband refuses, she can force the husband. She can, in Islamic law, she can basically get a qadi to force him to give Zakatul Fitr, but she doesn't have to. And then, if a husband cannot afford it, or the person who is financially responsible, that person cannot afford it, then the other person does not have to ask that husband, and then that person pays, the person is looking after pays Zakatul Fitr on behalf of themselves. Then when this husband or this financially responsible person is now financially capable, he has now some financial muscle, they cannot go back to this person and say, you were supposed to give Zakatul Fitr on me, I gave it on behalf of myself, so now pay me back for it. They're not allowed to do that. And then they say that Ataa ibn Rabah, from the scholars of Mecca, from the Tabi'een, he used to voluntarily give on behalf of his parents. He deemed it as something good to give on behalf of the parents. So the parents, is it obligatory on the son or the child or the daughter to give on behalf of them? The answer is no, unless they are poor and unable to work. Then the child then has to take care of them. So now let's say somebody you do not have to take care of. Can you give Zakatul Fitr on their behalf? The answer is yes, but with their permission. Why? Because Zakatul Fitr is an ibadah. It's an ibadah, and ibadah needs intention. Therefore, that's why we say, as I said in the beginning, Zakatul Fitr is obligatory on every Muslim. Because a non-Muslim has no intention. He has no intention because he's not a Muslim. So if he has an intention, it doesn't even count, because you need Islam first. So here, you need intention. So what happens sometimes, in some places, what they do is people gather, they make hampers. They make hampers during Ramadan, and then they give out Zakatul Fitr. And then later in the month, now closer to Ramadan, people are now coming and they're paying money. They're giving their Zakatul Fitr, let's say, in money. And then these people who are distributing on these first people's behalf, they distribute the hampers. So now what happens is, sometimes they distribute early in the month. So when these people come later with Zakatul Fitr, or on the day of Eid, let's say it's before Salah, the Imam might announce those who did not give Zakatul Fitr, they should give it now. So what happens is they collect money. They collect the money now, so there's Zakatul Fitr. And would it be valid? It's before the times, we're going to discuss it just now. But So what happens sometimes, they've already given the parcels away. They've already given the food and that out in the middle of Ramadan. So these people that are paying now, you can't say that we already gave out 100 parcels. Maybe there was 10 people who had paid on the 20th Ramadan when they gave it out. They gave out 100. So now 90 parcels were extra. And then 70 people came to pay near Ramadan on the day of Eid. You can't say that 70 of those 100 that we gave out, they count for these people. Why? Because they were given without intention. Without intention. Those people who paid the Zakatul Fitr later or on the day of Eid, they didn't even know that was being given out on behalf of themselves. They had no intention. They didn't ask, give it out on my behalf, nothing. So therefore, when those people, those representatives in the mosque or those volunteering the day before, when they get the money the day before Eid or on the day of Eid, they still have to go out and give Zakatul Fitr on behalf of those people. They have to make the hampers and give it out again, or give the money if it's allowed to give the money. But they cannot say that what we gave out in the middle of the month counts, because you need intention. You need intention. And connected to this is the Hanafi mas'ala. Connected to this is the Hanafi mas'ala. On this, the Hanafi madhab, you do not need to give Zakatul Fitr on behalf of your wife. You do not need to. It's not wajib on you to distribute Zakatul Fitr on behalf of your wife or your child, your elderly child, your baligh child who is sane. Because your baligh child who is sane, you don't have wilaya on him. You are not responsible for him in totality. If he is poor, that's a different thing. Then it would fall into a different category. You financially support him because he's poor. And if he is not sane, then you have complete wilaya on this child. You have complete responsibility and authority over this child. But now, when he's baligh and he's old, then even if he stays in your house, and you in general look after him, they say for this person and the wife, it's not wajib on you to give Zakatul Fitr on their behalf. But they say that if Zakatul Fitr is given by the head of the household on behalf of those in his household, whether it's obligatory on him to support them financially or not, then it will count. It will count. So then you ask the Hanafi madhab, they themselves ask the question, what about the mas'ala of the niyyah? You need the intention. They say the intention is there. Where is it there? It's there, urfan. It's a known intention that the father or the husband supports us. It's known that the father or the husband takes care of these things. So it's as if there is permission given to give on behalf of the child, on behalf of the spouse. Even though it's not, I give you permission, but it's kind of there, it's kind of known, so it would count. They themselves, the Hanafi fuqaha, they say, does this apply to only those where that it's obligatory on the person to spend on, or in general, all those that a person voluntarily and without a religious obligation looks after? Maybe all those living in his house, he has extra, he has cousins, whoever, they say all of them count. There's two opinions, but the madhab is that all of them count. Whoever you give on behalf of everyone, it would count because there's kind of a permission there. It's kind of a permission there. And then now this is a very important mas'ala. We're going to discuss the times. We're going to discuss the times of Zakatul Fitr. So you can have a wajib time, you can have a sunnah time, or the best time you can have it. Then you can have a makruh time and you can have a haram time. You can have a makruh time and a haram time. So they say the wajib time for Zakatul Fitr is at sunset on the night of Eid. On the night of Eid. So when we know it's Eid, that sunset, that's the time where it becomes wajib. So it's at that time, how much does a person own? You check at that time. And other things connected to it. We said you have to support, you have to give Zakatul Fitr on behalf of your wife. If you married after sunset, no Zakatul Fitr on her behalf. If you married before sunset, then there's Zakatul Fitr on her behalf. The same thing if a person could not afford, a person was very poor. And he was very poor, but he became rich. Let's say somebody gave him a gift, even a minute after sunset. After sunset, he does not have to give Zakatul Fitr. He does not have to give Zakatul Fitr. Because when it was wajib, he did not have. So connected to this is this Shaykh Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullahi alayhi. He says if a person is poor on the day of Eid, but then he becomes financially stable, then he says that it's something good for him to give Zakatul Fitr for those years which he couldn't afford. In the Shafi'i madhab, they say that if a person if a person becomes financially stable on the day of Eid. So the time of when it was wajib, he was not financially stable, he couldn't afford. But on the day of Eid, before sunset the next day, before sunset on the day of Eid, he then became financially stable. They say then it's mustahab, it's preferable, it's recommended for him to give Zakatul Fitr. So connected to this, it's very important to know this time when it's wajib, because masail connect to it. Here's another example. If a person did not know his wife was pregnant until after sunset, is there Zakatul Fitr? Anyone can answer?
I guess if he does not know, then there is no Zakatul Fitr.
That is correct. If a person did not know at sunset his wife was pregnant, there's no Zakatul Fitr, that's mustahab on the fetus. Another question. What if the wife is in labor, she's giving birth at sunset, and half the baby came out? As the baby is coming out, sunset comes. Sunset hits, the time that is wajib, half the baby came out. Zakatul Fitr or not? It would be what?
I guess they have to pay Zakatul Fitr because they know the baby has come now.
But only half came, ya Shaykh Umar.
I think it should have been born completely, or yeah.
That's correct. That's correct. They say that a child should be completely born. Completely born at the time of sunset, then you give Zakatul Fitr on behalf of that child. So that's very important to know, because other masail connect to this. They say if a lady gives birth, if a lady is in iddah, she's been divorced while she's pregnant. She's been divorced while she's pregnant. Her iddah is until she gives birth. So until she gives birth, she's deemed a spouse to that husband, if it's not the third talaq. So then so that means if the husband dies while she's in iddah, she will inherit. So let's say the husband dies while she's giving birth and half the child came out. Does she inherit or not? The same answer, the same mas'ala, it connects. So it's important to know these kind of little principles that are mentioned here in the fiqh, because the masail connect. So then they say it's permissible, not recommended, not wajib, it's permissible to give Zakatul Fitr. They say not more than 2 days before Eid. Not more than 2 days before Eid. In the hanbali madhab, not more than 2 days before Eid. So that means that on the 28th day, when it is sunset, from now you can give Zakatul Fitr. Anything before that does not count. That means that if there's 29 days of Ramadan, that means tomorrow's 29th day, then will be Eid. So that means you've given 1 day before the day of Eid. And if there's 30 days, that means there'll be 2 more days, and then Eid, so you've given 2 days in advance. So this you count with regards to the end of the month. So therefore, on the day 28 at sunset, so night 29, from here you can give. And the Maliki madhab, they have a few explanations regarding this. If I remember correctly, their conclusion is similar to the hanbali, 2 days as well. 2 days as well, but it's better to go back to the books just to read the details. And the Shafi'i madhab, they say once Ramadan comes in, now anytime you can give Zakatul Fitr. So not before Ramadan. And the Hanafi madhab allows Zakatul Fitr to be given by a person at any time in his life. Once it becomes obligatory on him, he owns the nisaab, he can give. Even if he gives 10 years in advance, it's okay. So they allow it given in advance as long as you wish. As long as you wish. The others give a stipulation. The others are stricter. But there is a second opinion in the Hanafi madhab, which is a decently strong position according to them. That is to give Zakatul Fitr not before Ramadan comes in. Not before Ramadan comes in. So when Ramadan comes in, now you're allowed. Similar to the Shafi'i madhab. And the hanbali evidence for this, Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu says this is what the Sahaba did. They didn't used to give the Zakatul Fitr more than 2 days before the day of Eid. And also because the Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, أَغْنُوهُمْ عَنِ الطَّلَبِ فِي هَذَا الْيَوْمِ, that you should give Zakatul Fitr so that the poor people, they have something to eat. They don't need to beg on this day of Eid. So if you give too much in advance, then this will not be achieved. But if you give it just a day or day before Eid, then they'll still have something left. Still have something left to eat, and they don't need to beg on the day of Eid, and they can also enjoy a bit. And they say the best time for Zakatul Fitr is to be given from when Fajr comes in on the day of Eid until the Salah. So that's the best time to give Zakatul Fitr. That's the best time to give Zakatul Fitr. And they say when a person goes out to the Musalla, then it's the best time. It's the best time, then he distributes Zakatul Fitr. That's why they say on Eid, we're going to mention it next week inshallah, for Eid al-Fitr, it's recommended to give the khutbah a bit later. It's recommended to give the khutbah a bit later, so people have more time to give out Zakatul Fitr. And this double achieves the objective of the poor people getting food on the day of Eid, because then you're just giving on the day, you're giving it to them. And then they say on the day of Eid, after the Salah until sunset, it's makruh to give your Sadaqatul Fitr. You have to give it. It's still on you, that you've missed the best time and the waajib time and the permissible time. So now on the rest of the day of Eid until sunset, it is makruh. After that, after sunset, you still have to give it. But in the hanbali madhab, it will be qadha. A person will be sinful for no reason if he delayed, but he still has to give it. After the day of Eid, it will be haram, but he still has to give it, and it will be qadha. In the Hanafi madhab, they do not deem it qadha. They deem it an action performed on its time. So they deem it ada, and they don't deem it haram, they deem it makruh. But makruh, slight makruh tanzihi. They deem it like that. That's why, as I said just now, if they gave the Zakatul Fitr to the person in the mosque before Eid Salah, the person still has time to give it after Salah, even later in his life, to give the Zakatul Fitr on behalf of those people. In the Hanafi madhab, it will not even be like a severe thing is done to delay it after Eid Salah or even later, because it will not be deemed haram. It will be deemed makruh tanzih. So it's still obligatory on the person to give it to those poor people. And we're saying the representative, not the person himself. He gave it to the representative that's going to give it to the poor people. And who you're going to give it to, we'll discuss it just now. Or who you have to give it to, we'll discuss it just now. And they mention the reason why can you do qadha of, for example, Zakatul Fitr, but not, for example, Udhiyah. If you miss the days of Eid, of Udhiyah, then you cannot do qadha. They say because Zakatul Fitr, the reason for it, it's an understandable reason. You're giving it for the poor. You're giving it so the poor can eat, so they can enjoy. It's a charity that you can understand the reason. But why exactly do we slaughter? What's the wisdom and the benefit exactly in the slaughtering? I mean, if you can say to feed or give charity or give meat or eat meat, you can get that in a different manner. But this whole specific ibadah of slaughtering, they say the reason, the Hanafi, I found this in the Hanafi books, they say it's not a clear reason. Allah knows the reason why. So qadha of it, there's no real reason that it makes sense why qadha should be done or can be done. For Zakatul Fitr, it makes sense why. And then as we said just now, if a person has to give Zakatul Fitr, he gives it at the place where he is going to be at the time when it's wajib on him, so his place. And also those he supports. If he supports somebody in a different country, does he give Zakatul Fitr in that person's country? No, he gives Zakatul Fitr in the country where his body is, in the place where his body is. And then, yeah, we almost finish inshallah. How much to give in Zakatul Fitr? How much to give in Zakatul Fitr? So they say, I said last time, that the hanbali madhab, for kafara I mentioned, but for Zakatul Fitr is 1 sa'. For everything that we're going to mention now, it's 1 sa'. So they say that you give 1 sa', the amount of the sa' is in our previous lessons. We mentioned how much is a sa', in the different opinions there. They say min burrin wa sha'irin aw daqiqihima aw sawiqihima. They say from wheat or from barley. 1 sa' of wheat or 1 sa'. They say 1 sa' of wheat or 1 sa' of barley. Or if you ground it up, it's called daqiq. If you ground it up and pound it, then 1 sa' of those things. So you can't take a sa' of wheat, pound it, that same sa', and then give it Zakatul Fitr. Because if you pounded it, the weight goes less, the amount goes less. So if you're going to pound, you have to calculate the sa' of the pounded again. So that's important to know. So you give wheat. In the hanbali madhab, they say 5 things. They say wheat, they say barley, they say dates, they say raisins, and they say aqit. Aqit is basically like kind of cheese, like a cottage cheese that's made from goat's milk. So they say these 5 things. They say if you don't have these 5 things, sorry, they say you cannot give from anything else other than these 5 if a person is capable or is able to find these 5 things, even if people do not eat these 5 things. They say this is what comes in the hadith when there was other options in Medina. There was options, there was wealth, money around, they did not give in money, they did not give in anything else. This is the hanbali madhab. And they say if you do not have one of these 5 things, then you give something else, a slur of something else that resembles these 5 things. So you give like corn, or you give a different type of grain, or you give, we said raisins, so fruits that can be dried, like a fig or a peach. These fruits that can dry, you can give a slur of those things if you can't find these 5 things. The other opinion of the Shafi'i in general and Maliki in general, and the second opinion in the Hanbali madhab, is that you give people in Zakatul Fitr that which they take as a staple in the country. That which they take as a staple in the country. So it must be something that people generally would eat for their lunch, for most of their meals, as staple. The main thing. What is Bali? Sheikh, I think we're going to have to consult Google to give you a correct answer there. To give you a detailed explanation. It's a type of wheat or grain or something. But if you Google it, inshallah, you'll get a clear barley. B-A-R-L-E-Y. So they say it must be the staple. It must be the staple that the people eat in most of their meals, most of the people. So that's the second opinion of the Hanbali madhab and the Shafi'i madhab. So the Shafi'i madhab say ghalib qutil balad. So it must be a staple most of the people eat, not one of the staples, but the one that most people eat. And the Maliki madhab, in general, they come to this, they say similar, but they mention 9 things. They mention 9 things. If one of these 9 things are found as a staple, then you give one of these 9 things. If these 9 things are not found, then you can give something else. But that you can check again in the books for more details. But in conclusion, because Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the Sahaba say we used to give in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam sa'an min ta'am. A sa' of ta'am. Ta'am translates to food. But the Sahaba, many of them deemed ta'am to mean bur, to mean wheat. So the Hanbali madhab have taken it like this. And the other scholars have taken that the word ta'am is food. So they say, Ibn al-Qayyim and others mention this, that the staple of the people of Medina were these few things. Hence, you look at the meaning, you look at the objective. Ibn al-Qayyim says that what's the use of feeding people, giving them things they don't even eat? Yes, it's come in the ahadith, but they don't even eat these things. So they say you give people what they eat. So if their staple in their food happens to be milk or happens to be meat, then you give that amount. For meat, you'd weigh plus minus 3 kg. 3 kg. So you'd work like that with the staple that they eat. The Hanbali madhab say the best to give for Zakatul Fitr, it's dates. Then they say raisins. Then they say is bur, which we said is wheat. Then they say sha'ir, which is barley. And then they say aqit, which is the cottage cheese. So they put it like that. They say tamr, dates, because that's what Ibn Umar radiallahu and other of the Sahaba, they specified these, that they used to give out like this. And like that they would conclude afterwards which one is most beneficial. So they grade it like that, or they rate it like that. The best that you should give out, recommended to give out, is dates, and then raisins, and then wheat, and then barley, and then the cheese that we said. And in the Hanafi madhab, they say for Zakatul Fitr, you give half a sa' of wheat, or 1 sa' of barley, or dates, or raisins. Or 1 sa' of barley, dates, or raisins. So you give that. Or you give the worth of one of these 4 things. The worth of one of these 4 things in cash. And they say that it's better to give in cash. Except in certain times when giving these people food would be more beneficial for them. Ibn Abidin mentioned this in the Hashia of Ibn Abidin. He mentions that giving cash is better unless there's certain times where it would be more beneficial to give people actual food, then you give one of these things. One of these 4 things. Can you give something else? Can you give clothing as Zakatul Fitr? The Hanafi madhab, they say yes. But how? They say you see the worth of any one of these four things, either half a sa' of wheat or a sa' of barley or date to tamr. You see how much does it come out to. Let's say it comes out to $15. So then you have $15. With those $15, you can then buy clothes, you can buy something else that you deem is needy for the people that they benefit from, and then you give that as Zakatul Fitr, and like that it will be valid. So you can't just straight, let me just buy an amount of clothes. No, you have to check how much. How much is one of these things that you give for Zakatul Fitr, and then that worth thereafter you can buy clothes. If you buy more, that's your own choice, but the Zakatul Fitr, the waajib is that specific amount. So that's how you do it according to the Hanafi madhab. Then they say this which you give in Sadaqatul Fitr, it shouldn't be old, it shouldn't be on the verge of expiring, it shouldn't be having defects in it, it shouldn't be moist, it shouldn't have moisture that will basically make it go bad soon. So they recommend you give something good. You give something good, something that the people can enjoy and they can eat, and that, you know, it doesn't just go bad soon, or it's something that want to not actually eat or throw away or something like that. Even old where the taste would change, they also don't recommend those things. And they say that it's permissible, they say it's permissible to give a group of people Sadaqatul Fitr that is for one person. So I have to give Zakatul Fitr, here's my sa', I can distribute the sa' portion for a group of people, or for a group of people. And they say it's also permissible for a group of people to give the Zakatul Fitr to one person. So here, myself and my family, 5 of us, here's our 5 sa', and we give it to one person. They say both of that is permissible. But they recommend that every person you give, you don't give them less than half a sa' of wheat or 1 sa' of anything else. They recommend that. And the reason for that, and connected to this, is I found the Hanafi fuqaha mention the wisdom of a sa'. Why do they mention a sa' for Zakatul Fitr? They say because a sa' will suffice for a person on the day of Eid. It will suffice for a person on the day of Eid. It will give them a decent amount of food to eat on the day of Eid. So that's why they mention a sa'. And hence they say it's recommended not to give somebody less than a sa' of something else other than wheat, which they don't recommend somebody gets less than half a sa'. And then the second last mas'ala, they say if a person has been given Zakatul Fitr, and then this person, now he was a recipient of Zakatul Fitr. Now then this person, as the day of Eid and the wajib time comes, he now has to give Zakatul Fitr. And he happens to give it back to the person who gave him Zakatul Fitr. This person who gave him Zakatul Fitr one day ago now has become so poor, he can be a recipient of Zakatul Fitr. So this person gave it back to him, it will be permissible. It will be permissible. As long as there's no trickery involved. As long as you don't give me Zakatul Fitr, then we make a plan and then I'd give it back to you tomorrow. So the same thing like we mentioned, Shaykh Umar of the Zakah. As long as there's no plan to come in, from the back door, then it will be permissible. It will be permissible. And then who should Zakatul Fitr be given to? They say the recipients of Zakah are the same recipients of Zakatul Fitr. So basically it has to be fuqara and masakin, those people who have nothing at all, or who have less than what they need to live, less than what they need to cover their expenses, their monthly expenses. All of those people, you can give them Zakatul Fitr. And they obviously have to be Muslims. They have to be Muslims. And I mentioned this earlier, but all of these kafara and zakah and fidya, all of these things, they have to be to Muslims and people who are recipients of zakah. So they have to be having less than what they need to live. And I think then we've covered most of the masail. They say, one more mas'ala is a wife that's pregnant. If a husband divorced her, either the third talaq, meaning he can't take her back, or they've divorced for another reason like khul' or fasakh, the wife requested talaq, or the Muslim council or Muslim judge have divorced the husband and wife, called fasakh, meaning in this, while she's sitting in iddah, she's pregnant, in this type of iddah he can't take her back. In this case, the husband does not have to give Zakatul Fitr on her behalf. Why? Because while he has to spend on her, he spends on her on behalf of his child that's in her belly. But it's not wajib on him to give zakah on the fetus, so he doesn't have to give zakah on the wife. So the final mas'ala is the mas'ala on giving zakatul fitr in another country. So we said that zakatul fitr should be given in the country where a person is in, or the place where the person is in at the time when it's obligatory on the person, which is, as we said, at sunset on the night of Eid. So here the ulama say that it's permissible. The ulama today say it's permissible to give zakatul fitr in another country if there are people there that's more in need of the zakatul fitr than the poor people in your country. So we said that if there's no poor people in your country, you can give in another country. In this case, there are in your country, but there are people that are more in need in another country. They allow it. And there are some of the early ulama who allow this. Some Shafi'i scholars, some Hanafi scholars, and they allow it either in general, or they allow it, but it's makruh to do so, or it's allowed if there's a need or benefit to give to the people in another country. And the principle is, when something is makruh, if there's a need, then the fact of it being makruh goes away. So if it would be makruh to give in another country, but there's a need in another country, then it will not be makruh anymore. So the ulama then say there's scope for permissibility. And lastly, they do say, number one, it's given in your country, but they also say, number two, that the poor people in your country, they have the first right to zakatul fitr, to your zakatul fitr. They have the first right to it. Hence, they should be given first. So to go out of this for the poor people in another country, it's because of a need. But because of what we just said, of them having the first right to it, other ulama say that a person could give in another country if he thinks that there's enough zakatul fitr. If he thinks there's enough zakatul fitr from other people in his own city or his own town or country, that will basically suffice for the poor people of his own country, or it would cover for most of them, then in this case he could give to people in another country. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. So the question is, can money be given zakatul fitr when there is kind of a benefit in giving zakatul fitr as money? So we'd say to that, the answer is that most of the ulama say you give the staple food of your country. But if there's a reason not to, if there's a reason where money would be better, for a reason that makes sense to most people why money would be better, then you can take the Hanafi opinion, and Sheikh Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullahi alayh, he says you can also give money when there's a benefit in it. When there's a benefit in it, where money would be more beneficial to a person than food, then you can give money. And that's the same thing the Hanafi mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, where they say money is better. They say money is better at all times, unless at certain times giving specific food to people will be better. So they look at what would be better according to the situation of people. Though they say money as a starting point is better, and the others say food, the staple food. But when there is a situation where money would be better for certain people or certain country, then money can be given, and it's an opinion of one of the four schools of fiqh, and it shouldn't be an opinion that's fought with, and Allah knows best. But for us, for our dars, we have Eid inshallah, and then done for the month of Ramadan. We end there. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين.